Over 110 family members. That's how many Dr. Ramzy Baroud lost in Gaza's genocide, and he stopped counting a year ago. Among them, his sister, Dr. Soma, the 166th doctor murdered by Israeli forces, his 11-year-old cousin, Lema, an aspiring journalist who wanted to be the voice of her generation, killed alongside her mother, her father, and 4 siblings when Israeli warplanes flattened their shelter. Lema had been documenting the genocide on her phone. Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast, to our listeners and viewers around the world. We're diving here into meaningful dialogue about Palestine, offering an insight and context that is so often missing from mainstream media, while celebrating Palestine's rich traditions, culture, and heritage. And today we are joined by Dr. Ramzy Baroud, a refugee from Nuseirat camp, who became one of the world's most important Palestinian historians and journalists. He founded the Palestine Chronicle 25 years ago. He's written several books documenting Palestinian resistance and has delivered expert testimony at the Gaza tribunal that found Israel guilty of genocide. Hanan, how did Dr. Baroud come to our attention?
So during the Gaza genocide, we discovered the Palestine Chronicle that Ramzy founded in 1999. And it's become really an essential reading and a rare source of truth when Western media manufactures consent for the Gaza genocide.
Dr. Ramzy Baroud, welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast. We're thrilled to have you here.
Thank you for having me, Shamim.
And just to say ahlan and welcome, and if we may dive in straight away. So you were born in Gaza in a refugee camp, and your dad was 9 years old, I think in 1948, when the Zionists expelled his family from a village outside of Jaffa. And your dad became a freedom fighter with the Palestinian Liberation Army. And sadly, your older brother, Anwar, died as a toddler because of the UNRWA clinic had no medicine. And you grew up watching Israeli soldiers handcuff children at your school just for displaying the Palestinian flag. And I believe one classmate was shot running with a small Palestinian flag, which is quite traumatic for anybody to go through. So Ramzy, can you take us through that, the first Intifada, the Palestinian uprising, when you were a teenager, when you picked up stones and moved forward, even as bullets were flying at you and your friends around you? And I think in your words, you said that's when you became a free man at the moment. So can you give us the background?
Thank you very much, Hanan. Thank you, Shamim, for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be talking to you. And thank you also for starting with this particular question. It's kind of the origin story. And I take great pride in the fact that this is my origin stories. I'm the son of Fallahin parents, peasants from southern Palestine, from a village called Bid Daras. My father was a freedom fighter at a very young age, joined the Fidaiyin movement in Gaza that was fighting for the right of return back to historic Palestine, today's Israel. And I just basically opened my eyes to the world, and that was the reality. We are living in this refugee home, in a refugee camp. My father is a socialist. We always laughed at the notion that he claimed to be a communist, and I used to, especially as I learned more and more about communism, being raised a socialist, I used to challenge him sometimes, just talking about, like, Dad, you keep talking the means of production. What means of production in Gaza? We only have oranges in the sea. There's absolutely nothing else to talk about. But that was my reality, kind of a progressive family, if you will, within the environment of Gaza, in which the vast majority of people were peasants and fallahin and refugees. One of the shocking things about growing up in that environment is that you actually don't know what the world is like outside that environment. You have this idea that this is the world. It is normal to go to school every morning and walk for miles in worn out shoes, uh, always feeling the cold, always struggling, always hungry, lining up in front of UNRWA feeding centers, waiting for that sandwich that may or may not come. And when it comes, it's usually a small piece of dry bread and half an apple, and always being shoved in this way or the other, whether by the UNRWA workers or by the Israeli army at a checkpoint. You honestly start thinking this is normal. This is okay. This is life, and this is what it's that's maybe what others are experiencing. Yes, we had access to television. We had very limited access. We had Jordanian TV and an Israeli TV, and the Israeli TV was telling us day and night that we are mukharribin, we are troublemakers, we are terrorists, and therefore we are receiving our due punishment. And the Jordanian TV, on the other hand, was not exactly a window to the world. It's not really until I left Gaza many years later when I realized that the world is not like that. You can actually get into a car and drive for hours without running into a checkpoint. Children in elementary schools are not supposed to be subjected to regular beatings or being shot at, and that's not okay, and it's not normal. So in some strange sense, my real shock wasn't the living in Gaza part as much as it was the leaving Gaza part, because I had no idea. I had nothing to compare the world into, and I think in a sense that what made me even angrier, in a sense, once I began realizing that you can't hold a nation hostage in refugee camps and put them in concentration camps, shoot at them, kill them, dehumanize them, prevent them from moving from, we couldn't even see my uncle living in Shati refugee camp. The distance between Nuseirat and Shati was about 15 minutes. We could literally go for years without being able to actually access, the road, the main road, the Rashid Road, to get to see my uncle's house or my auntie's house in Rafah. 25 minutes from Nuseirat. It seemed like she was living in another continent. We hear stories about Aunt Rasmiya, but we have no idea who Aunt Rasmiya is. That was the life of a refugee. And this is in many ways the very impetus of the revolution carried out by the sons of those refugees during the first Intifada, in which I experienced in full from beginning to end, as if life was not difficult enough. Even the sea was tabooed. We couldn't even, it was our only salvation. Israel may do whatever it wants on earth, but at the end of the day, we went to the sea. Even the sea became a taboo. We see it from a distance, we couldn't reach it. So you have this kind of a process. It's almost like a process of collective suffocation. It's like the Palestinian being, this collective called the Palestinian is being literally suffocated slowly and dying slowly and fighting for its life slowly. These are the kind of stories that I speak about, because many people are under the impression that all started with October 7 and the genocide and all of that, but there's a much more complex story that started long before that. And this generation is nothing but irrational progression of the Nakba generation that was pushed to Gaza in their hundreds of thousands, completely penniless, weakened by war, injured, browbeaten, humiliated, and tried to build a life within the world's largest open prison with very little tools. And they've been doing so for the last 77 years.
And so going from that, we're having to walk miles to school, that the school conditions are, I imagine, difficult. From that refugee camp, you went on to earn a PhD in Palestine studies at the University of Exeter, where you studied under Israeli historian Ilan Pappé. And then you went on to found the Palestine Chronicle in 1999, and you've written 7 books. Tell us about your forthcoming book. I'm a novelist and filmmaker, so stories are everything to me, really. And your book, Before the Flood, which is out next February 2026, traces your family, I think, through 77 years of displacement and resistance. Those stories are so important to hear. As you say, people think history began on the 7th of October. It's important to personalize and make people understand what life was like Can you tell us about Before the Flood? Is that what the book is about? Is it
Absolutely. I think
Yeah.
that, thank you for this question, Shamim. I think the story starts with me going from Gaza to Seattle, Washington. I was prevented to go back to my university, Birzeit University in the West Bank. That's where I was pursuing a political science degree. I was involved in various political activities with various student unions and groups. Israel basically arrested all of us. Those in the West Bank were put in prison. Those in Gaza were deported back to Gaza. I had no other option, and I felt like my entire future was collapsing. I ended up in Seattle, and that's just a whole different story. But when I first went to Seattle, I was just shocked how the Palestinian narrative is not never the Palestinian narrative. I'm not talking even about mainstream American media. We know that. We know the Israeli Zionist influence. We know the way Palestine and Palestinians are being depicted in mainstream media and academia. But I'm also talking about the people who are supposedly the pro-Palestine camp. So I joined immediately. Oh, there's something called Palestine Solidarity Group in Seattle, and they care about the Palestinians. For me, that was a bit of a shocker. There was the assumption that nobody cared in the West. So I joined, but time after time, there was this strange depiction of Palestine that was more of a fantasy than a reality. On the one hand, you have this um, kind of Palestine seeing through Israeli prism. So you kind of have the few Israeli professors or anti-Zionist Jewish professors or academics who are depicting Palestine in a certain way, and they are being sourced as the foundation of discussion on Palestine. At the time it was Israel Shahak and among others. That's where the conversation was. So in other words, there were no Palestinians. I mean, yeah, Edward Said would be lucky to kind of find his way through that whole shovel. But the point is, there was no Palestinian representation in the Palestinian solidarity. The discussions often would start. It's almost like a shy way of defending Palestine without coming across as if you're defending Palestine. So you ended up talking quite often about the psychological harm that is felt by Israeli soldiers for occupying the Palestinians. So here I am supposed to hold hands with some, activist in Seattle, bemoan and and cry over the psychological, well-being of Israeli soldiers who are tormenting my family in Gaza. For me, this is all real. These soldiers are the very ones who killed Ra'id Mwannis, shot Ala al-Jibawi, and my friends, my neighborhood friends. They're the very soldiers who beat up my mother, and that's another story. So for me, there was this confusion, and the confusion eventually became frustration. Why are we not talking about Palestine within the Palestinian discussion? So that's when my hand fell on a book by Howard Zinn, A People's History of the United States. I was a young student at the University of Washington, and I was happy that there is such a concept from an academic point of view that is somewhat semi-academic. I mean, at the time, positionality and people's history were not really kind of verified as good academia or traditional history and all of that. And it's still somewhat of a marginal subject communicated by radical leftists and that sort of thing. But just the idea that there is such a thing as people's history. So I began imagining what a people's history of Palestine would be like. So I would say since then, for the last 30 years, I have been in a constant attempt at exploring and perfecting in my own way, and maybe not completely imperfect from the view of others, the way of communicating the Palestinian story through history from below or people's history. My PhD deals with this exact subject. All of my books is a constantly refined attempt at creating platforms in which the people are the focus, of history, but not as witnesses to it, as makers of history. And that's, by the way, is a completely different genre. There's some confusion sometimes when people say, oh, Ramzy, so you do oral history. Well, yeah, but it's not ethnography, it's not anthropology, it's not me saying, I have this theory about how things work, and I need to bring some people to attest to the facts that I am putting on the table. It's actually the other way around. It's discovering history through people. My father was a freedom fighter. My first attempt at, kind of locating myself within the story itself. And that did so very well. And many other books came out trying to mimic that book in a different way. The Lost Earth was my attempt at discovering the modern Nakba. We keep talking about a Nakba al-Mustamirra, but without actual, or the continuous Nakba, but without actually kind of delving deeper into what does that mean from an intellectual point of view. Yes, of course, the continuous Nakba indicate that the original sin that led to the establishment of Israel and the destruction of the Palestinian homeland is still there. True, from a quick political argument, but what does it really mean in terms of the identity of the Palestinians? Do the Palestinians of Santiago, Chile feel as Palestinian as those living in Ain al-Hilwa in Lebanon? Do the Palestinians who are being pushed with the Syrian refugees on their way in this endless quest for safety in Europe during at the start and throughout the Syrian war, do they connect to Palestine at the same level that those rooted Palestinians in Gaza? What makes us a people? What is the commonality that we have? So it was kind of an investigation into modern Palestinian identity, and so forth and so on until the genocide took place. And one of the issues that a lot of people struggled with is that of resistance in Gaza. Because again, you have this kind of sanctified attempt at telling the Palestinian story, but avoiding this difficult subjects, because it might be too harsh for the sensibility of Western audiences who have bought into this idea that, Hamas is the same as Taliban, Taliban as Hezbollah, Hezbollah as ISIS. And a lot of people are scared to delve into this subject. So I wanted to talk about it, but I want to talk about it as part of a larger popular resistance that the Palestinian people have been waging against colonialism, British colonialism, Zionist colonialism, but also Israeli and Zionist occupation for the last 100 years and more. So the story of Before the Flood starts in an orchard in the village of Ya'bad near Jenin in the West Bank. And it goes from that moment in the early 1920s, connecting it all the way to Gaza today through individual stories. What makes the book quite painful to write, or what made it quite painful to write, is that some of the characters who are being interviewed for the book in Gaza were actually killed during the war. So you kind of have, it would not be exaggeration if I would say that the witnesses to that history, at least half of them are gone. By the end of the book, they were no longer there. So the book continues their stories by injecting them as part of the narrative, but their stories in there. And someone else from that family would continue telling that story, and so forth and so on. It was one of the most difficult books to write. This is positionality tested to the absolute limit. It's no longer an academic subject. It's about just survival. And you are the story. You are telling the story. My sister ends up being killed during the narration of the story. I don't know how I managed to finish, but on the other hand, it kind of became kind of a form of therapy. Like when something horrific happens, my response to it, aside from writing an article and speaking in a TV program and tweeting about it, is to go retreat to my office and start writing more in the book, as if it's my way of saying, This is not going to be forgotten, and it's going to be part of the story, even if the witnesses are being killed.
Yeah. You mentioned your family and your sister. You've lost over 110 family members, and we tell you we're so sorry for that loss. It's inconceivable and too much for anybody to bear. And you've stopped counting a year ago because, as you said, all of Gaza is your family. Can we talk a little bit about your sister, Dr. Soma Baroud, who was assassinated when Israeli forces bombed a taxi near Khan Yunis? And she was a doctor, the 166th doctor to be murdered by Israel. And her husband, Hamdi, is a dean of law at a university in Gaza, was also killed 9 months earlier, I believe. And their home was demolished in September 2024. There's so much dehumanization of Palestinians, yes, but also this kind of mass statistic version of Palestinian loss. Could you tell us a little bit about your sister and what she stood for?
I must say before that, I think the degree of loss, is I don't think I'm not even sure if I will ever be able to fathom that until the day I die. We are used to, we lose loved ones in various situations. As a Gazan, I lost many loved ones throughout the years in horrific situations, but there was always this element of time that heals and solidarity from the community that survives, and somehow we just keep moving along. But to reach a point that my sister is killed, and we are struggling to find a place to bury her, I don't think we will ever. I mean, I don't think there can ever be coexistence with Zionism, ever, ever. And if some people are willing to forgive, we're not. I tell you, Gaza will not forgive. I know Palestinians will not forgive. But as a Gazan, I tell you, we will not forgive under any circumstance. It's not about like, well, okay, we will give the Palestinians a state, maybe, but is, disarmed. And no, no, no. These are irrelevant conversations to us at this point. It's not about some clever political solutions that may give Israel a little bit of breathing space because it's in a PR crisis. It is the kind of event in history that is unparalleled by any extent of the imagination. We've never lived anything like this. Yes, the history of Palestine is a history of war and resistance and struggle and pride and dignity. But to be finished off in front of the entire world that is just basically debating numbers, counting numbers, estimating numbers, with nobody intervening in the meantime to do anything. It is something that I don't think we can fully comprehend for this generation. It's something that only time is going to tell us the extent of the collective psychological trauma resulting from this. We just don't have time to stop. And this is part of the reason I said I stopped counting, because I don't want to know anymore. I know since the 110, a whole family, the Badrasawi family, which is the subject of my book, and our cousins, 12 members were killed in Shati, and another Baroud killed in Khan Yunis, and more in Rafah, and so forth and so on. But we don't have the emotional capacity to even know what that means. With a sister is a different story. She was we're six boys and one girl, and Soma was the eldest. In fact, in my book, My Father Was a Freedom Fighter, I speak about Soma a lot. And her relationship with Anwar, the firstborn who died due to the lack of medicine in the UNRWA clinic in the Nuseirat refugee camp. But she was traumatized at a very young age that her best friend, Anwar, and died under these circumstances. And she kind of inherited this. My parents were poverty stricken, but at the most, I don't know how to describe it, like the most impoverished state was the state of Suma's existence. So she comes to this life to a completely impoverished family living in a single refugee bedroom, nothing else, no bathrooms, nothing of that sort, total poverty. And there's that family story linked to Soma, which is my father, this communist man who, believes that women should be a priority in terms of education more than men, considering the nature of life and society, is being told by one of the neighbors that, what are you talking about? Educating someone like Suma? You are lucky if you get her married. And then, and then my father, and that's the origin story of Suma, where my father makes this declaration in front of the neighborhood that she would be a doctor. And there was a laughter. I mean, you don't even have anything aside from a single bedroom or a single room house. You don't even have access to food on regular basis. You don't have access to clean water, and you make a declaration that a girl in a refugee camp in the early 70s is going to become a doctor. And somehow he makes it happen. Somehow he makes it happen. She was absolutely brilliant, always the top of her class. When the high school results came out, and she was number 8 of the top 10 students in the entire Gaza Strip, she was so mad at herself. She was ashamed. She would not even leave the house for days after that, because she was expected to be the number 1 student in the entire Gaza Strip. She had very, very high expectations, and she delivered. I mean, she returns to Gaza from Syria, a doctor. She starts working at Al Ahli Hospital for a while. Then she joins the Shifa Hospital. She got married to this lawyer who later on became a professor at Al Azhar University, and then the dean of the law school. And then they built this amazing life together in Khan Yunis. And then she started being affiliated with Nasser Hospital. And she says, the most difficult thing about this genocide is that I am pronouncing the death of so many of the children that I brought into this life. Honestly, I feel like there was something that died in Suma during the genocide before her actual death. And she told me that. She said that because her husband was killed before she was killed, and her mission became, helping her children survive while finding the body of the husband. Eyewitnesses said that he was killed by an Israeli drone while running away, and he had an issue of movement, so they caught up with him very quickly. An Israeli drone, a quadcopter killed him. The body was somewhere, then it wasn't found, and she spent several months trying to locate the body. While going to the Nasser hospital, other hospitals, other clinics, and amputating children without anesthesia. When I started talking to her, this is someone who had this incredible optimism about life, despite the fact that she was a refugee from Gaza under the siege, during the siege. But there was always this thing. She calls me to tell me about a latest novel that she read, and she wanted to discuss the symbolism of the novel. And I would say, I'm in an underground train in London. We talk about it later. It's like, I'm dying to tell you about the novel. She had this incredible, like a teenager learning things from the first. She always had this thing about her, so much energy. And that energy was always somehow distributed to those around her. There was this clique of women around her in Khan Yunis who became doctors and nurses, felt empowered with her presence. She became a family doctor at one point. Then she had other specializations to help in terms of therapy and women empowerments and that sort of thing, purely done on Palestinian terms, not this kind of Western imposed sectionalization of Palestinian society, but no, grassroots, centered attempts by women in Khan Yunis to empower women in Khan Yunis and in the rest of the Gaza Strip. So she wasn't just a doctor, she was a leader. When she was killed, there was this complete sense of denial. Like I mean, yes, people were being killed in their tens of thousands, but there was something about Soma that kind of made many of, until now, I receive messages from her friends, and whether those in Gaza or left to Egypt, and they tell me they still cannot believe that she's gone. She was an exceptional human being, and she made a real difference in society. And honestly, I'm talking to you, and I'm still not fully haven't fully processed the fact that that she was killed. I mean, I wasn't sure really what I was like. No, 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 that can't be. Yeah, yeah, but they are saying Soma Baroud. How many Soma? She had a unique name. How many Sumas are there in Gaza? And until I managed to confirm by seeing the video in the Palestinian news agency Wafa, and I didn't. Thank God I didn't see the body, but I saw the white bag that was carrying her to the morgue, and it had her name on it. And she was always so keen on writing her father's name in the as her middle name, as a way of saying that my father made me a doctor. So, so the name actually was written on the coffin, and I was like, as if they knew in the hospital how important it was for her to write her name in full. Anyway.
Truly, truly tragic and barbaric and evil. What's, as you said, what happened to your sister, her husband, and everyone else who's gone through that. And it's really they didn't care whether it's civilians, doctors, anybody, including children. So if we can talk about your cousin Lema, I think she was 11 years old, and she was an aspiring journalist. I think she wanted to be like you, a journalist. And in one of her videos, she stood with a group of children, and they were all shouting, "Stop the genocide." I think that was what they were saying. And I believe these children were sitting near their parents' mass grave. They were all orphans. So can you talk about a bit about Lema? What was she documenting? What did she want the world to know? And also about her murder, because there are over 20,000 Palestinian children from Gaza who were genocided on purpose by the Israeli genocidal regime, if you like.
Yes, of course. So Lema was it's that family that I referred to, Badrasawi family. It was Lema, her sisters and brothers and parents killed in one Israeli strike. It was actually my daughter Zarifa who brought my attention to Lema. She went to visit Gaza just a few months before the genocide, not knowing that many of the people in the photos she had me go through her album and her phone, and we realized that most of the characters that she was standing and taking photos with are no longer with us. It's like it's trying to find her identity, but at the same time meeting these people for the first and last time. And one of them was Lema's mom. So during the genocide, as you already know, hundreds of Palestinian journalists, influencers, intellectuals, and people who have access to communicate messages, using various means, whether through mainstream, alternative, or social media, were killed. I mean, the number that's 266 is not correct. I mean, these are people who might be certified through the Gaza, media office or something of that nature. But the fact is, the number of journalists and storytellers killed in Gaza is much larger than this. So as a result, this is an incredible society. So you have these children who are kind of taken upon themselves, and really they mean it. They take upon themselves the responsibility of telling the story, because many of the witnesses and many of the storytellers and influencers and journalists are being killed. So if even children became journalists in a sense. And of course, there is, the success story of Ramzy, very popular with the family in Gaza. So once in a while I would receive an email from maybe a cousin who was born, or a nephew who was born long after I left, wanting to be a journalist and that sort of thing. So Lema's mom tells Zarifa, my daughter, that Lema wants to be like your dad. And I said, yes, of course. What can we do? But maybe we can translate. She said, no, no. She speaks in English, and she has very cute accent. You kind of have to listen sometimes more than once to realize what she has to say. And I said, well, she can shoot a video, and maybe we can send us the raw footage, and we can work on it from there. And it turned out that the other characters, the other actors that she's creating in the backgrounds were all of her friends in the refugee camp in Mawasi, all lining up and doing their bits and stop the genocide and that sort of thing. With, total purity and innocence, thinking that maybe when the world knows that this is happening, someone is going to do something. The thing that broke my heart actually about that video, aside from Lema herself, is that later on I discovered that that the children, when they were sitting in the video kind of facing a wall, that was a mass grave of their parents, which I did not know when the video was published. But honestly, the last thing I expected, that Lema, I mean, it was, I was training myself to believe, yes, they took a generation of journalists, but our children, are going to stand up again, and they are going to rise, and they are going to rebuild. They are going to be the new intellectuals of Gaza, the new journalists of Gaza. But to go after the children themselves is just absolutely incredible and devastating. And again, that makes the degree of Israeli criminality at a whole new level. I mean, I don't think there is enough language in the familiar discourse regarding Palestine and Israel that would allow us to describe what is happening in Gaza at the moment. The fact that you are not only engineering a genocide, but socially engineering the very demise of a whole nation, and you speak about it openly, giddily, publicly, and mainstream media and even social media shelter you in every possible way. And when you go out there and you say, but they are killing children, they delete your accounts and they shadow ban you for even the mere mention of that degree of criminality. So here you go. Lema is just one of 20,000 plus stories. And these are the stories that are obvious to be told, but there are stories that children are dying from cold in Gaza, whose stories are not being told. It's dying from starvation in Gaza, whose stories are not being told. I think we have our work cut out for us, in a sense that, the need to platform and to create channels like this one to convey the stories and the agonies and the pain of all of these people. Because if we don't tell that story, the New York Times is not going to tell it, and nobody else will.
Absolutely, absolutely, which is why we started the Enlightenment Podcast, because we felt it's really important to tell and to share these stories. And they would, up till now, foreign journalists have not been allowed in, or if they have at all, it's with very sort of limited access. So the victims became, if you like, the journalists, including your niece or your cousin. And Ramzy, you also talk extensively about two concepts which that are central to Palestinian identity. You talk about sumud, steadfastness, and muqawama, resistance. And for example, recently when Palestinian hostages were released in the exchange, they immediately started reciting poetry. When your sister Soma worked as a doctor in Gaza for 3 decades, that's another form of resistance and muqawama. And I believe she was also treating the poor for free. So can you explain to our audience, because Palestinian, I'm sure you covered it in your book, but just for the audience, the importance of sumud, of muqawama, and how it's impossible, no matter what the Israelis do, including a genocide, they cannot crush, if you like, the very essence and fabric of Palestinian life, whether it's poetry, planting trees, armed struggle, and really how international law recognizes the right of occupation or those occupied to resist through armed struggle, but yet the Palestinians have been demonized for doing that. So, sorry, too many questions, but it all links
No,
in.
it's absolutely beautifully put. I think the problem started in back to the very first question you asked, or my answer about the sectionalization of Palestinian culture and the Palestinian struggle. Where this this idea that Palestinians have to fit a certain box that we created for them, and to the point that many Palestinians now expect that the world can only listen to them if we speak in a language that we presume is the proper language for the West to understand. To unpack that, just a little, the idea of the sectionalization of resistance, good resistance, bad resistance. So you have those who, supposedly resist using cultural means, and that's the way to resist, as opposed to those who are resisting using armed struggle. Um, in our society, we don't have that sectionalization. I would be lying to you, if I tell you that, yeah, indeed, we are thinking around these lines. Like, I can only resist this way, but not this other way. There is no muqawama. Muqawama is resistance. There is no muqawama that is there to cater to specific sensibilities outside of Palestine. Muqawama is something that it's innate. It exists in our culture, in our society, since the very start, and it was a direct response to colonialism, British colonialism, actually, I would say to injustice, not just colonialism. Even during the age of the Ottoman Empire, there was a degree of resistance to certain injustices and taxations, unfair taxations, and all of that. And by the way, I spoke about that before the flood as well, and about the Red Valley, in the Jordan Valley area near Jericho, where all the dissidents, the political dissidents, and the rebels would escape to the Red Valley for safety against those who are trying to oppress them, being the Ottomans, and later, of course, British colonialism, and later Israeli settler colonialism. So this is something that we have been doing in every manifestation. The fact that you are wearing, and along with Shamim as well, this beautiful Palestine map, and I mean that's a form of resistance. You are declaring a position. Gramsci would refer to this as the war of position. You are being part of this in the way we dress, in the way we talk, in our thobes, the that our women wear, the embroidery, the colors of the embroidery, the region from which the embroidery was, or that particular kind of thobe, or a dress is made, linking our present or past, and situating our culture into very profound and complex and beautiful heritage. It's all a form of resistance, but it doesn't mean it is just that. I mean, you know, if Israel is carrying out the genocide in Gaza, you're not going to have Palestinians sitting and painting as a form of resistance. I mean, we are talking about genocide here. If I've never touched a gun in my life, seriously, ever. Guns touched me by Israeli soldiers. When they were like trying to disperse, our protests, or pushing or shoving. I personally never made the decision of ever touching a gun. But if I knew that there was something physical I can do to save my sister or my mother from beatings, or my father, or my cousins, I would have done it. It is something innate. It's I don't need to make an intellectual diatribe for it. I don't need to explain myself and justify myself, and stir a controversy by saying I would have done everything in my power to defend my sister. And I think this is how Palestinian muqawama is built. It is a communal process that is wholesome and cannot be divided. And it's not about guns and bullets. Look how many guns do those who are financed by the US, working for the Palestinian Authority in terms of trying to protect Israel's security in the West Bank. They are Palestinians and they have guns and they are way more than any number of fighters in Gaza. But nobody refers to them as resistance. Israel doesn't seem to be troubled by them. How come they are not asking to disarm them? Never once. To the contrary, their numbers grow and grow. So the issue is not about firepower. It's not about guns. It's about the use. Are you using the guns to defend your community? Then you are a terrorist. And so forth. But because Israel has managed to create this, incredible narrative, entirely falsified narrative, linking Palestinians to the war on terrorism, and the entire story, and how Netanyahu kind of jumped into the fray following 9/11 and creating all of these, false associations between Palestinians and what else was happening in Afghanistan and so forth and so on. A lot of people are scared. They don't want to talk about these issues because they feel like by talking about them, they are already compromised. But in the process of doing so, you have already demonized the Palestinians. You have demonized the Palestinians. The West Bankers are more pro-resistance than the Gazans. I mean, just in case someone wants to play this old game about, Gaza versus the West Bank is more pro-resistance than Gazans. And I think maybe the support for resistance in Gaza kind of went down just a little bit because people are living in the midst of the genocide. And if you tell them, what would it take for this to stop? Maybe they are willing to compromise on some ideas for now. But the West Bankers are so behind the resistance. So how do you explain that? And how do you explain by taking a certain position, you're actually judging and marginalizing the Palestinian people and their priorities? So as a historian, as an intellectual, as an author, my job is to create the context and explain the historical context and humanize that historical context and let people know this is the reality. This is why people fight back in Gaza, as if we need to make an argument of why should anybody defend himself. But this is the historical reality. And I am going to develop that historical reality for you, not as a reactionary response to claims made by Israel and Zionism. I am going to do it entirely based on Palestinian historical priorities. So the story, in other words, does not start with the Balfour Declaration and Zionism and Herzl and he held his conference at Basel or not that. No, it's going to start from the priority and the relevant history of the Palestinian people. It's not Zionism that created Palestine and Palestinian culture and even Palestinian nationalism. We have existed as a community, living a perpetual history, a continued history in that land for thousands of years. And if you don't believe me, read Nur Masalha's book on, Palestine, a 4,000-year history. It's not Herzl who invented us. We invented Herzl, in a sense. We give Herzl his meaning. But eventually Herzl and his Zionism will have to be marginalized, and Palestine will return to the continuity of creating meaning and creating historical discourses in its own right.
No, I agree. And I would argue we go back to 15,000 years of a continuous sort of through different invasions, religions, etc. But you're right about the power. For example, from my own family, from my mom's side, Samia Halabi, the artist, she was born in 1936, and she that's her way of expressing. From my dad's side, whether it's through food, Fadi Kattan, whether Anne-Marie Jasser's Palestine 36 and all her films, whether Victor Kattan, he's also a lawyer, and he writes. So, and that's different generations who are all resisting through their own, whether it's art, whether it's film, whether it's books, whether it's food. So, and we did podcasts with all of them for anyone who hasn't seen them. But that's all part of the fabric. It's the love of Palestinian culture and heritage and who we are as people. Just to go back to your notes, yeah.
And much love and respect, Hanan, to all these people. I'm familiar with them, and I have tremendous amount of love and respect for all of their contributions.
Thank you.
I wanted to talk about apartheid, Ramzy, if I may, because I come from a South African background. My parents and grandparents were born to Indian origin in South Africa, so they endured apartheid before they had to leave in the early 60s. Palestinians live under daily Israeli apartheid, and most people have not been to Palestine. Can you just give us a snapshot of the kinds of segregations, discriminations, humiliations that are piled on people daily under the system?
Absolutely. I've been to South Africa several times, and in many ways, I feel like I built a community there. Some of them really I would consider family, because of their genuine activism and love and support for Palestine. And I always use the South Africa example of the ideal activist, in a sense, someone who actually truly shares personal and collective experiences, and they are part of the struggle, not because it's a fad or anybody is doing kind of cosplay activism. It's people who feel the pain and experienced it, and familiar with it, and they feel so much anguish and anger over Palestine, all for the right reasons. In Palestine, I mean, it's funny when Jimmy Carter came up with his book about even raising the question whether Israel is an apartheid state. You had this rage and anger in mainstream American media. All these people going out with their torches and their forks, trying to take Jimmy Carter, trying to take him down, accusing him of madness. He must have lost his mind. I in order for me to go, just to give you and this is, I'm telling you, a thing that happened, or a reality that existed before the apartheid wall. I mean, before they actually built a massive wall of hundreds of kilometers, dividing, not dividing Israel from occupied Palestine, but rather built largely on occupied Palestinian land, in which people enter in and out of that wall based on their ethnicity and based on their background and so forth. In order for me to go from my refugee camp in Gaza to Birzeit University, I needed something like 6 different documents, right? So in order for me to, that was during the first Intifada, where there was, aside from the curfews that would extend military curfews that would extend for weeks, sometimes months at an end, you had that everyday curfew starting at around 7 p.m. every night. You can't leave the house at 7 p.m. For 7-8 years. So in order for me to leave before, from 7 p.m. until dawn, in order for me to leave to the taxi place in Gaza City, I needed a permission that would allow me to go through the army checkpoint that would take me to Gaza City. And from Gaza, I needed a permission to get to the Eretz checkpoint. At the Eretz checkpoint, I needed what they call the magnetic card to enter through Eretz. Then another card to enter through the West Bank, and another card to stay in the West Bank. That is in addition to the normal IDs and all of that. And all of this based on the classification that I'm an Arab, I'm a Palestinian, I am a Gazan. And quite often, they would allow us to go to the West Bank, but without giving us the permit to stay in the West Bank, which means that the moment you reach the West Bank, you are immediately illegal. And that process at the time was kinder, because we had to go through something like 7-8 different military checkpoints. Now it is, first of all, it's impossible. You cannot go from Gaza to the West Bank. But even within the West Bank, entire communities are now segmented and segregated by walls, barbed wires, military checkpoints. There are roads that they cannot drive in because they are not Jewish. It's called Jewish-only roads. And by the way, this is not our classification, Maybe it should have said Israeli only. No, no, no. It actually says that. It actually says that. When I saw that the first time, I think I think I was going to Jericho from Ramallah, and you go through all, and the poor taxi driver is like how do they deal with that if you are not experienced in driving in around in these parts? You could find yourself in a Jewish only road near a settlement you're not supposed to go to. Well, is that a problem? You can just turn around. No, you can't, because they are able to see your driver's license that indicate that you are an Arab. So you could actually get shot at, arrested, beaten. If the settlers caught you, you are in deep trouble. You are going to be sleeping at the hospital tonight if you survive. I mean, it's just incredible. All of everything that existed there existed as Arabs and Jews. The Arabs are at the bottom, discriminated against in every possible way, and the Jews are elevated. And this is where the problems of sensibilities here, because there are certain things you can't, like, if you listen to Al Jazeera or Al Arabi, whatever, like TV station that reporting directly from Gaza and speaking to anyone in Gaza, they are not going to tell you the Zionists are doing this or the Zionists are doing that. They are going to say Al Yahud, right? The Yahud means the Jews. Because in their mind, they're not being anti-Semitic, they're not being racist. This is the reality in which they live. There's a group of people who designated themselves as Yahud, who are imposing this apartheid system and enforcing it with blood and iron every single day. So we get punished for not being part of that group, and they have the right to punish us. And the entire legal system in that country is based around that. And if that was not bad enough, I think in 2018 they come with what is it called, the
Jewish
Jewish
national nation state law.
the Jewish nation state law, in which we are degraded. Our Arabic language is degraded. Our culture, our right of self-determination is. So this is the language, this is the discourse that is used there. And you will have these organizations in the US, these Zionist pro-Israel organizations, that will take something written or said in an Arabic media interview in which a child would say, Il Yahud did this and that. And they would say, you see, they teach themselves, their children, anti-Semitism. And you understand why that language is being used, because it's their language, not our language. It's just infuriating. So this is why when Jimmy Carter, back to the start, when he came and he said, peace or apartheid, they went mad for the mere suggestion that there is a possibility that an apartheid regime is being built. When it's not being built, it was there from the very start. Even if you look at the history of Zionism before the establishment of Israel, when groups like the Histadrut, the labor union that existed in Israel, since the early 19th century, or in Palestine, in historic Palestine, since the early 19th century, all the way to 1948, and now with a different manifestation since the Nakba, the entire apparatus of the Histadrut was built on Arabs cannot work in our, so they would own the businesses and ensure that Arabs cannot work there. So sometimes the land will be acquired through some rich Arab families that are living in Lebanon. And so the Fallahin, become without jobs. So they go try to work in some businesses in Haifa and the Jaffa port. The Histadrut will not allow them to do so, with the idea, if you are penniless and you have no job, you have no other option but to leave. So Zionism itself was based on a model of apartheid, racism, and also ethnic cleansing. I mean, that comes from the very original foundational structure of Zionism. So no, with all due love and respect to Jimmy Carter, it wasn't apartheid being built in Palestine. And then after that, you have Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Beit Salem, and others are saying, well, according to our investigation, indeed there is a system of apartheid. Well, what do you call everything that has been taking place for the last 100 years? It's always been apartheid, and it's becoming a far greater and more criminal system of apartheid than ever before.
Yeah, and it's based on Jewish supremacy, and the fact that they refer to us as Arabs and not Palestinians is another form of erasure to kind of erase the whole culture and the history and the being indigenous as Palestinians to the land. But just to say, like, my family is Christian Palestinian. My dad is from Bethlehem, as I mentioned. My mom is a Nakba survivor from West Jerusalem, and when they were forced to flee, German Jews took over their house and their building in Haifa, where she was born. And this continues. Now the world is starting to see this sort of Palestinian ethnic cleansing and land theft. And you talked about the Nakba al-Mustamirra, the ongoing Nakba, which hasn't stopped. Can you just talk a little bit more about what that means to the audience who aren't aware of it, and this sort of Palestinian erasure, and at the same time, the Nakba al-Mustamirra and the sort of ethnic cleansing of Palestinians?
Hanan, I feel like this genocide has opened many eyes at a very, very high price. Many eyes of people around the world to what's happening in Palestine. But it's starting with the genocide. The focus is what is happening here? Why is this happening? Why are children being killed in such large numbers? Why are they starving? And why aren't we able to do anything about it? But here's how it goes. It's like there is a story, and that you kind of dig into that story and you realize that there is a bigger story beneath that story. And you keep digging and digging and digging. And whatever you do in the process of digging is gonna always take you back to the Nakba. It always is going to get. Of course, there's even the Nakba itself has its own historical context, but it will always take you back to the Nakba. And this is where people like you, people like Victor, people like numerous intellectuals now have the responsibility of guiding people through that process of digging. We don't want you to stop here. You can't stop here. Just because Israel has slowed down the rate of killing just a little bit, it doesn't mean the story has ended. In fact, we want you now to listen to us. For once, just listen to us. For the longest time, we have been told that we are a liability to ourselves. I mean, honestly, we have been in the audience. We are the storytellers. We have been in the audience, and we have been witnesses. We are witnesses to the Israeli crime if we are to be dignified enough with the position of being a witness. But at the end of the day, the analysis, the context, the judgment, the history is written by someone else. Now, this is our opportunity to come and say, we have been right all along. One thing that we have been right about, for example, is that personally, I've always argued, and you will see that in my books, that Gaza is the center of Palestinian history. Yes, settler colonialism, and yes, Gaza does not have so much land mass and resources like water in the West Bank, but the critical importance of Gaza comes from the fact that resistance in Gaza never ceased a minute since 1948. They organized and fought back in the Fidaiyin movement almost immediately after the Nakba, and they are still resisting until today, refusing to leave. They did a Ramallah-based research group, polling group, did a study during the height of the genocide, when all of Gaza was essentially in these refugee encampment areas, Mawasi and elsewhere, and Nuseirat. And they discovered that well over 70, something like 77%, if I'm not mistaken, said that if they had the opportunity now to leave Gaza into Sinai, they would say no. So what made them who they are? And this is kind of back to what we have been saying as Palestinian intellectuals and historians and academics, that you have to understand history from our point of view. Because we do not create history, we mirror the history that's created by the people themselves. Otherwise, you will never understand the Palestinian story. And you will always subjected to the same kind of historical reductionism that has been taking place since the very start. So and I hate to use the word opportunity, but if I must, I will say, let's use the genocide as an opportunity to reorient the story of Palestine around the Palestinian people and their stories and their struggle, because this is the only way you can fully appreciate the humanity of the Palestinian. I don't want you to appreciate the Palestinian as a dead Palestinian, as a statistic, as a number in a morgue. I also want you to understand the vitality of Palestinian history that is of continuous struggle, continuous inspiration, aspirations for independence, for freedom, the fact that they never give up hope, the fact that they never abandon their faith, the fact that they continue to aspire and inspire the world around them. The fact is, and this might make even some people uncomfortable, you feel bad for a victim, but you don't necessarily rally behind a victim. You don't respect a victim. The world is rallying around Palestinians because they refuse to be reduced to that only of a victim. And they are the ones who have the kind of agency that is exposing Israel and Zionism like never before in the sordid history of that ideology. So this is our responsibility, to help people keep on digging. You can't stop at October 7. You can't stop at the number of Palestinian children killed. Thousands of Palestinian children were killed in previous wars as well. You can't stop at the massacres of Khan Yunis and Zaytun and Nuseirat and Rafah. Numerous massacres were committed in Palestine, from the Deir Yassin to Sabra and Shatila in South Lebanon, to numerous other massacres, Tantura, so many others that were also committed by the same people, by the same ideology, for the exact same motive. So they need to understand, and we need to be available there to explain, by abandoning the old tools of the discourse and taking responsibility for our own history.
Absolutely. Ramzy, in October, just now, 2025, you delivered expert testimony at the Gaza Tribunal in Istanbul. So this is a people's tribunal modeled on the historic Russell Tribunal. And they found Israel, of course, guilty of genocide. Can you just tell us about this tribunal? What does it do? Why does it matter at a time when institutions like the ICC and the ICJ are just failing badly? Just give us a sense of the evidence and how Gazans who are so isolated and cut off from the world, although not from world opinion, I want to say, how do they manage to expose Zionism so comprehensively?
Absolutely. The importance of this tribunal is for the very reason of why the ICC and the ICJ, among others, are failing. Justice is not a perfect concept. Justice, unfortunately, when it's transmitted through legal channels, it's going to always be hit by power. And those with the power are those who interpret law in the way that they find fit. They are the ones who are going to implement the law when the law fits their interest, and they are going to ignore the law when the law does not serve their interests. In the case of Palestine, this cannot be truer than in the case of Palestine. But even then, it's really taking this example into a whole new level. I mean, when you see the actual judges are being tried themselves, or are being punished or sanctioned by the US State Department for even looking at the case of Palestine. I mean, that should be enough to tell us about the power paradigm that exists in the world, and the complete, not only lack of respect for international law, but the criminality in which international law is being treated by the US and others. So the Gaza Tribunal is an attempt at trying to imagine what law would look like if it was allowed to be law. It's almost like an exercise, but it's going to be vital at one point in the future, because it is linked to the role played by civil society regarding Palestine from the very beginning, particularly in the last 20 years, but particularly in the last 2 years. Because of the lack of international mechanisms to hold Israel accountable to its war crimes against the Palestinians, and the fact that those who are supposed defenders of international law that waged wars on Iraq and Afghanistan and Libya and God knows where else are the very people who are actually creating the crime scene and giving the murder weapon to Israel to do far more horrific crimes against the Palestinians. Many in civil society kind of began changing, roles. Instead of being just a lobbyist pushing the government to do this or that, or try to achieve change at a local level within their own society, they began gathering in an international solidarity movement. And we've seen many manifestations of that movement, starting with the Second Palestinian Intifada, the ISM, International Solidarity Movement in the West Bank, that I think in many ways kind of created that cadre of activists. Many of them became very involved in their own societies, teaching and educating about Gaza. But Gaza itself became a big challenge for civil society because it's isolated. They are not allowed to go in there, so they try to go there through the sea. And thus we saw what happened. I think it was 2008 when the Free Gaza movement managed to actually reach Gaza for the first time and for the last time, I believe. I'm not sure if one or two times that the group managed to actually get to Gaza, creating some sort of linkage between civil society and Gaza. That there is a place here that is of an urgent need for international intervention. But since the international community is beholden to American power, civil society has to play that role. And that has evolved throughout the years, and particularly through this genocide, because of the degree of inhumanity. I mean, it's one thing that that a genocide has taken place in history. It's a whole different thing that you are watching it 24 hours a day. And you are seeing children being burned, and you see the silhouettes of burning bodies in the back of your screen, and you can't do anything about it. And that's where the rage comes from. And so we began seeing throughout this genocide, civil society kind of amplifying or increasing the nature of their collective efforts to put pressures on governments, to boycott various companies, to protest in mass, which has been incredible, really, in terms of creating mass awareness across the US. I have been to many countries since the genocide speaking about Gaza. And every time I go somewhere, I am stunted by the degree of awareness that has now been channeled to every element of society. You go to a small town in the mountains in Abruzzo in southern Italy, and you are approached by ordinary people who seem to be removed. Nobody is disconnected from the world, but they have their own local struggles and problems, and yet somehow they come and they approach you and they talk about Gaza with so much passion, so much anger, accusing their government of being fascist. Gaza, Gaza, they keep saying everywhere you go in the world. How did this happen? How did we reach the point that there is this degree of awareness and penetration of the Gaza discourse and the Palestinian discourse that happened despite of mainstream censorship and bias, despite of social media shadow banning and censorship, despite of everything? The justness of the Palestinian cause has reached numerous societies around the world, including societies that have been historically supposedly pro-Israel. So you have all of this, and now we see civil society going further and further. The boat become 5, become 10, become hundreds. And not just that, they are also trying to teach us what if international law was true to itself, what it would sound like. So the Gaza Tribunal, I think, is one of the advanced manifestations of civil society taking responsibility, again, that should have been shouldered by international legal and political institutions, and they are creating a model of what the world should look like if we lived in a better and more just world. It might seem like an intellectual exercise at the moment, but in my opinion, this is something that is helping civil society further discover its own power, its own capabilities. And just one last thing regarding that, the trials in the ICC, or the arrest warrants against Netanyahu and Gallant in the ICC, the case by South Africa and others at the International Court of Justice, most of the research, most of the work most of the grassroots, digging of information and collecting of testimonies and creating legal precedents, all of this is actually, or most of it is done by civil society. So it's not just the kind of symbolism that we saw in Gaza Tribunal that in my mind will become more and more relevant in the future. But many of these individuals at the Gaza Tribunal were also very much involved in the ICC and the ICJ cases as well.
Yeah, and I think, as you mentioned, it's also I think, indicted not only Israel, but other governments, weapon manufacturers, media, institutions, universities. You talk about the role of universities and so on, but they seem to have actively enabled this continuous genocide, the crime of all crimes. And, we continue to see whether the airports, the seaports, etc., and the settler colony of Israel they continue to receive weapons, shipments, support, despite the genocide. So what do you think, how do you see this sort of machinery, whether with all the support that continues despite this genocide? And can you talk a bit about these sort of various, whether it's universities, sort of governments, manufacturers, etc., and the media, think tanks, and how do they continue to support it? And how can we change that? What will the tribunal do besides, like, how effective will it be, basically?
Right. So the tribunal kind of managed to give us an idea of what wholesome justice would actually look like as well. This is not about, well, we have evidence that, alleged, accusations that Netanyahu may or may have not carried war crimes. We all know it. We all see it. He's priding himself with it. He speaks about it day and night. They talk about, dropping nuclear bombs on Gaza. The Israeli president, no, there is no innocence in Gaza. Every child in Gaza is responsible. So the Israelis themselves are. Do we actually need years to establish that there is intent to commit genocide with the very people who are carrying the genocide, telling you that more or less we are actually doing it? They are not calling it genocide, but we are doing it. And it's the right thing to do, and we are going to continue to do it. And yet somehow the ICJ has been, talking for the longest time just to establish whether there's an intent or not. So we kind of move beyond that at the Gaza Tribunal. It's very obvious that there is a genocide and there is the intent to commit it. But also there are those who are making it happen. There are those who are sustaining it. There are those who are justifying it. There are those who are whitewashing it. There are those who are, helping Israel sustain its economy, sustain its trade routes, sustain its public image. And it is a massive apparatus of organizations, as you said, institutions, universities, governments, of course, companies, and many others. Number one, we need to recognize who they are. And I do believe Francesca Albanese, kind of expanded on the pre-existing list at the United Nations that names and shames the Israeli companies that were involved in the apartheid, or they are still involved in the apartheid in Palestine. But there is an expanded list of those who are also involved in the genocide in Gaza. So now we know it's not a conspiracy theory, it's not a rumor. This is well documented, well researched by official sources that indeed these are the people who are making this happen. Israel would have run out of weapons, or did in fact almost run out of weapons after 30 days of the genocide in Gaza. If no more weapons were coming to Israel, a lot more Palestinians would have been alive today. So someone has purposely ensured that Israel is capable of sustaining its genocide for it. Are these people innocent from the crime, knowing what Israel has done in the first few weeks and first few months? Germany is now resuming its supplies of weapons to Israel. After seeing what Israel has done, Germany is so keen for some reason on the destruction of the Palestinian people. I mean, I know this sounds kind of like out of context, but what the heck have Palestinians done to Germany to deserve such a fate? Why do you keep supplying Israel with weapons to kill our children? What have we done to you to this extent? You're trying to deal with your own historical contexts and traumas and problems at the expense of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinian children who are dying from cold and hunger to begin with, and you are adding, the firepower of burning them alive. So they cannot, these entities, these governments cannot be off the hook. They have to be named and shamed. And that also is a message to civil society. This is what makes the Gaza Tribunal different. That you have assigned us with the role of telling you that Israel is indeed committing a genocide, and they are, but we would also like you to follow up on what we have decided, that these media companies, these organizations, these countries are continuing to allow Israel to sustain that genocide. So this is why this is the kind of struggle that, yes, it's a global struggle, but starts locally. So everybody needs to look in his city, in his town, in his village. What Israeli products are coming in that benefits the Israeli apartheid and the Israeli genocide? Is there a military manufacturer, say in Italy, like Leonardo, for example, that is giving Israel weapons to kill Palestinians? Your responsibility as an Italian, as British, as American, as Canadian, as South African, as whomever, wherever, is to ensure that your locality, your city, your province, and your country is not sustaining the Israeli genocide, because this is on you. It's one thing to tell Israel stop killing Palestinians, it's a whole different thing that you allow your government to sustain the genocide of the Palestinians from your own tax money. And this is kind of back to civil society to do its proper homework here.
Yeah. So the thing is, we want scale at civil society, but the people are being fed these lies through the media. You've worked at Al Jazeera as deputy managing editor of Middle Eastern Eye, and then founded Palestinian Chronicle in frustration with mainstream media. But we've all been watching CNN, the BBC, the New York Times either ignore, gloss over Gaza genocide, put it into a passive tense. New York Times even fabricated stories about mass rape, which they then had to apologize for to justify Israeli violence in some way. How does this propaganda machinery actually work? We all know it's there. What is going on behind the scenes that allows or pushes mainstream media to manufacture consent for this genocide and get away with it?
Absolutely. I mean, that's the key, manufacturer consent. I mean, the idea that Israel is, I don't think, I mean, yes, of course, mainstream media bias, but I'm not really sure if the term bias here is the proper term, because it just feels like as if we had different expectations that corporate media is going to act against the interest of the corporation. And many of these corporations are linked to arm manufacturing, linked to governments, linked to these big lobby groups. They are doing what is scripted. They are doing what they perceive is good for profits, for money, for the companies in which they defend their interests, and so forth and so on. I would be surprised, for example, if CNN takes a position that is completely inconsistent with those who fund CNN. That doesn't make any sense. So I feel like having expectations that mainstream media is going to behave any different, I think we'd be wasting our time. The reason that I started the Palestine Chronicle is that I felt that no matter what, no matter whom, the source of the money will always determine the agenda of the people behind it. And I came up with a theory. It's not tested, and I don't think it's a scientific theory, but I argue that nobody is going to give you $1 million until that person has an agenda, right? Maybe 999,000, that's a different, but $1 million, it means that there's an agenda. At times we find ourselves willing to coexist with that agenda. Maybe there's enough overlapping, but there is something else that you have to compromise with. But if you establish independent media platforms that is not associated with big money, is not associated with the Gulf, it's not associated with big government interests, you will be able to operate freely. And it's really sad that many of the existing Palestinian media organizations, like the Palestine Chronicle, like the Electronic Intifada, like others, they are so underfunded. I mean, nobody ever reaches out and say, hey guys, how can I help? Nobody does. So you are just, you are reliant on readers to come and support you, while big money are going to organizations that have agendas of their own. So I think one thing we need to focus on, because we've learned so much from what happened during the genocide, is that independent platforms work collectively. By myself, Palestine Chronicle is not going to defeat the New York Times. We don't have that kind of budget, we don't have that kind of funding, and we don't have that kind of permission to operate. I mean, we are like being treated as criminals at times. But we have to have so many platforms like yours, numerous platforms. That's how we manage to actually fight back and defeat mainstream media. And to prove that to you is that Hagari, the former spokesperson of the Israeli army, just a couple of days ago, he came out and he said, we lost the social media battle. Now, when he says social media, it's not just social media as Facebook and whatever. It's just because social media gets its information from somewhere. Who creates the raw information? If it's not the Electronic Intifada, Mondois, the Palestine Chronicle, these independent journalists who are working with other independent journalists in Gaza and the West Bank and elsewhere, these organizations create the raw material. And a lot of this raw material, a lot of this content comes directly from Gazans. I mean, I always speak about Maria Hannoun. It's like I'm her biggest fan. She's 5 years old in Gaza, 5 years old. And she always has a fiery message. Sometimes Mahmoud Darwish, sometimes she has a direct message to Donald Trump in English. She keeps referring to him as Mr. Trump. Every day there's a message from Maria Hannoun. 5 years old, I promise you. But I listened to her with just to kind of get a sense of what Palestinians in Gaza, how are they thinking? She stands behind the rubble of her house, looking so beautiful with a kufiya, and always finishes with a victory sign. We are the ones who try to. We don't tell Maria Hannoun what to do. We platform Maria. We platform hundreds of Palestinian voices and witnesses and journalists and intellectuals and academics. And it's that material that finds itself on social media. That's the material that ends up people are interacting with and reproducing in numerous different manifestations. That's the work that matters. That this is the work that not only will make the difference, it's not a theory, it has already made the difference. And the Israelis themselves admit it.
Absolutely. And then there's a big disconnect, as you said, between the citizens of the world versus their corrupt governments and institutions and what people have seen. It's like the mosque has dropped. I don't think it'll ever go back. But let's talk also about a recent event. You mentioned the Hagari recently, but also a very recent horrific event from my perspective is the UN Security Council resolution, which really is a total disgrace. And it's sort of enabling this justice and oppression instead of actually protecting the victims, the Palestinians. They're protecting those who committed the genocide. And you have all the Arab and Muslim parties, if you like, going with it and pushing for it, which is really, that's another conversation about how they've abandoned the Palestinians. But could you please talk about, Ramzy, about the how they ignored the ICJ ruling and how this council and of course the corrupt PA Vichy government, because they're using it, well, the Palestinians agreed to it, so why should we not vote for it? And how our voices in the diaspora, over 8 million, plus the Palestinians under occupation, never really, well, first of all, the PA doesn't represent them. No one voted for them forever. And as you said, why now more than ever we have to continue with this and to make it a permanent shift versus just a band-aid solution, if you like.
Right. International law has always failed Palestine, failed many other countries in the global south, let's be honest. But Palestine has always been kind of this litmus test for the international community that time and time again, they failed. Not only they failed, but they actually created the legal foundation to give a settler colonial regime the right to exist over the ruins of someone else's homeland. I mean, this is very, and especially it happened during a time that supposedly there was some kind of a rethink in international law. The idea of self-determination was becoming more popular. Countries, that used to be colonized, they somehow were, being freed. They were granted their independence, not, out of pity by these settler, by these colonial Western regimes, but because of the struggle and the fight for justice and freedom of their own people. But there was a whole new momentum going on around the world, except in Palestine, the exact reverse was taking place. So the international community was very much involved in shaping and justifying the creation of Israel as a settler colonial regime. But here's the problem. When that happened, when Israel was established by the United Nations, the understanding that many intellectuals and historians had is that, well, these were different times. Israel, I mean, at the times, most Arabs were not free. They were not independent. The global South was hardly represented in the United Nations, and therefore these were, Western colonial and neo-colonial powers shaping the world, and the Palestinians ended up paying the price for it. But how are we to explain that there's a new partition plan that has just been approved by the United Nations in UN Resolution 2803? And how do we explain that the Balfour mandate, or the Balfour Promise, but also the mandate system of the early 1920s has been re-implemented or re-envisaged and recreated in Gaza, with the very British colonialists, the likes of Tony Blair and others, potentially becoming the new governors? I mean, this happened now when the global South was fully represented. But how can you also explain that as Russia and China were mulling over the idea that maybe we should veto this resolution? It does not seem to be fair. It gives too much power to the US over the lives of Palestinians and will definitely destabilize the region even more. They are preempted by Arab countries, including Qatar, but also the Emirates and the Saudis and the Egyptians and the Turks, by saying, oh yes, beautiful resolution and the world should support it, putting Russia and China in a position of saying, well, if we veto this and Israel returns to genocide, and the Americans have been saying that, then it's going to be Russia and China blamed for it. These are countries that are completely out of our geopolitical spaces entirely, and they have their own fights in Ukraine and Taiwan that they are dealing with. Why should they come and start contending with the Jordanians and the Egyptians? So you put us in a situation, Arab and Muslim countries, that you're actually confirming and affirming the American attempt at creating a double hegemony within Palestine. And you are, as we are trying to free ourselves from the Israelis, you bring the American and the British governor of Gaza. I think this is one of the most shameful episodes of history. And I think every Arab country that supported, voted for, or encouraged the support, the yes vote on this resolutions are going to live in infamy, and there can be no historical justification to what they have done. But here is the good news. They are operating at the end of the game. Zionism has been exposed. Israel has proved that it is incapable of achieving political ends using its superior military power. The entire Western world, 67 countries or so, were somehow directly involved in supporting Israel through the genocide, and Gaza is still standing. So I don't think UN Resolution 2803 or 100 other resolutions are going to change the outcome. You just made life unnecessarily more difficult for the Palestinians, and a lot of children are going to die, and a lot of people are going to suffer, and a lot more bombs are going to be dropped on Gaza. But now Israel can say we are doing it with the legitimacy of international law, which is a very strange, ironic kind of reversal of history. And this time around, Arabs and Muslims are unfortunately standing fully on the American and Israeli side.
Yeah, and clearly you have Arab Zionists now just fulfilling that agenda and trying to normalize, sadly. But inshallah, as you say, because they have underestimated the Palestinians so far, and our Samud hopefully will continue, and we'll see a free Palestine. But to talk about solutions, I'd love to know your thoughts, because from my perspective, at its core, Zionism is ruthless, it's brutal, it's expansionist, it's a racist ideology, and we've seen the cruelty of Israeli, apartheid and its ethno-supremacist genocidal project. And there's no place for such an ideology in the 21st century. They say it's Netanyahu, it's the Likud. No, it's the ideology itself. And the two-state delusion that they sold us all on is just that. It's a delusion. But many people still believe in it. And I would love to know what your thoughts are, because for me, I've moved to a one democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea, with justice, full equality, freedom, and human dignity for all. And of course, reparations and resource restitution and land restitution, with the right of all Palestinians to go back as per international law. Maybe it's a dream, but I'd love to know what justice for Palestine looks like for you, what freedom looks like, equality, and because how are you shaping that narrative as a historian, as a writer, as a journalist?
I think you said it perfectly, Hanan. I don't think it's a dream. I honestly don't. We are beginning to, back in the day when we used to talk about the implosion of Israel, it just seemed like this far-fetched idea. Israel exists based on the degree of legitimacy it is receiving from the world. You delegitimize this ugly regime, you expose it for what it is, Israel is going to find it extremely difficult to sustain itself. Honestly, from a purely, like, if I am a Zionist and I'm trying to think as a Zionist, for the survivor of Israel, I would give Palestinians a state and make it happen somehow. You know what? I would even say I apologize for the genocide, because they don't have an idea of what is coming their way. People are no longer thinking around border lines, like, meaning, oh, the settlers are bad, but the Israeli. No, this whole idea that this is Netanyahu's problems only. Israel is innocent from the sins of Netanyahu and few others, being Veer and Smotrich. No, people are seeing Israel as Israel for what it is. Gramsci used to argue that the moment that the traditional intellectual, those who are like somewhere between the people and the state, but they are really operating within the state arena, the moment they take an anti-state position, you know that the whole thing is about to collapse. The entire system, the entire state is about to collapse. Now, when Gramsci was talking about traditional intellectuals, he was talking in the 20s and 30s. Now, the traditional intellectuals can be celebrities, they can be actors, they can be professors, they can be media personalities or social media influencers. And we are seeing this new manifestation of the traditional intellectual entirely and completely on the Palestinian side. Yeah, of course, there are exceptions, because there are those who are linked 100% to Israel. Without Israel, without the kind of validation, the money, the lobby group, they will cease to exist. But there is a massive migration that's happening to the Palestinian side. And it's growing. It is growing, and it's now even mainstream media, like in countries like Italy. I mean, they are run essentially by a government that is, I mean, some people call it fascist, and some people say, well, inspired by fascist regimes. Even Italian TV now, for example, would show you events in which all the singers and actors and the dancers are all dressed in Palestinian flags, and they can't say anything about it. They will get in trouble with their own people. So there is a massive migration happening, and the legitimization of the Palestinian people and their struggle, and the delegitimization of Zionism. You said it rightly. when you said that, there can be no existence with Zionism. And I think that's the solution. I think the idea that we need to, kind of come up with a political, this clever political solution, as if Netanyahu is even willing to consider the possibility of a just solution to the Palestinians, I think it's a waste of time. I think the fight here is between two forces. One that is fighting to survive as a nation and as a people, and to continue their struggle towards freedom and justice, and these are the Palestinians. And those who are fighting to completely eradicate the Palestinian people through genocide, through ethnic cleansing, through dehumanization, through erasure, through all of these elements. One has to win. There can never be the possibility of them coexisting under any circumstance. We know that the Palestinians will win. Even the Israelis themselves are saying this. Benny Morris, for example, in an earlier interview with Haaretz before the genocide, he came up with this idea that, listen, this Palestinian culture is going to take over. They will take over. It will. He said it's going to be a generation, about 30 years, and that was like 10 years ago. About 30 years before somehow we merge into Palestinian society. And of course, this is going to be the case because Palestine has existed since the beginning of history. Before the written word was written, Palestine existed. And we have dealt with every military occupation and invasion from the Napoleon to everybody else before and after. And we are still there. And we are still there with the same determination of the roots of an olive tree. It just doesn't go. And even when an olive tree dies, the root's still there. We are that nation. We are the olive tree. We cannot go anywhere. It's Israel that is going to end up being erased because this kind of racism, this kind of erasure, this kind of exclusivism, this kind of chauvinism cannot exist for a very long time, especially not in our region.
Yeah.
Get rid of Zionism. That is your solution, because the people of that land will find a way to merge back into a whole, and they will find a way to continue shaping history for future generations. You want to call this one-state solution, you call it whatever you want to call it, but there can never be coexistence with Zionism whatsoever.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that moral clarity there at the end. I wish we had longer, but Ramzy, I wanted to say a huge thank you to you. We will be posting the links obviously to the Palestine Chronicle, which Hanan and I highly recommend that everybody listening to this takes a moment to go over there and subscribe and read, and to all of your books in the podcast links. And really, thank you for that. Before we close, I have a quote from Rafat Al-Ariya, the beloved Gazan poet and professor who was intentionally targeted by Israel and killed in 2023. He said, "If I must die, let it bring hope. Let it be a tale." And I think that is similar to the work that you do, Ramzy. And thank you for that. History will judge each of us by how we respond. As you said, everybody's responsibility is to take up this issue with their governments, with their communities, in the way that they spend their money. So thank you for your moral courage, for documenting Palestinian lives for 25 years and more, and for refusing to let the world look away, even as this genocide has taken too much from you personally. We appreciate it.
Thank you, and shukran for all the truth and courage and all that you do for Palestine. And I highly recommend your books. And as Shamim said, following the Palestine Chronicle. And as I wrap, I just want to add: stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, speak up, and most importantly, take action for justice for Palestine, because our collective voice is making a change. And in solidarity with appreciation, see you next time. And again, shukran, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Shamim and Hanan, for taking the time, for all of your brilliant questions, and for the amazing work you continue to do.